The rain did not stop after a day, or a week. By late summer, the Mississippi and Missouri rivers had been in flood stage for nearly 3 months. Farmland disappeared under brown water that stretched horizon to horizon. Levees that had stood for decades failed not from a single surge, but from saturation, seepage, erosion that worked through clay and earth until the structures simply collapsed inward. Over 1,000 levees breached. 50 people died. The floodwaters covered an area roughly the size of Lake Superior and refused to leave. The weather pattern locked into place in April 1993. A stationary jet stream held moisture-laden air over the central United States, drawing water vapor north from the Gulf of Mexico and releasing it as rain across Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and South Dakota. The rain fell steadily, not in catastrophic bursts, but in persistent, soaking events that gave the ground no time to dry. April brought above-average rainfall. May continued the pattern. June intensified it. Meteorologists tracked the system, watching as high-pressure ridges blocked the jet stream from moving, creating what they called a blocking pattern. The atmospheric configuration was unusual but not unprecedented. What made it catastrophic was duration. Week after week, storm systems moved along the same track, dumping rain on already saturated watersheds. By June, soils across the Midwest were fully saturated. Every new rainstorm had nowhere to go but into rivers and streams. The upper Mississippi Basin, normally capable of absorbing seasonal rainfall through a network of wetlands, fields, and forests, became a funnel. Water that would typically infiltrate the ground now ran directly into drainage systems. Tributaries swelled. Reservoirs filled. Stream gauges recorded levels that climbed steadily, not in sudden spikes but in relentless upward trends. The system, designed for peaks and recessions, faced something it was never built to handle: unrelenting input with no recovery window. Rain fell somewhere in the basin almost every day from April through August. The ground could not absorb it. The rivers could not drain it. The water accumulated. The Mississippi River at St. Louis remained above flood stage for 144 consecutive days. The Missouri River stayed in flood for 62 days. These were not rivers anymore. They were inland seas, sprawling across floodplains, merging with tributaries that had also overtopped their banks. The Des Moines River flooded its capital city. The Illinois River inundated towns along its length. The Iowa River, the Raccoon River, the Wapsipinicon, every tributary fed water into the main stems faster than the system could move it downstream. The Mississippi's discharge at St. Louis peaked at over 1 million cubic feet per second, nearly 3 times its normal flow. The Missouri River, already swollen from Rocky Mountain snowmelt and spring rains, added its volume to the Mississippi just north of St. Louis, compounding the surge. Backwater flooding occurred across hundreds of miles as the swollen Mississippi blocked smaller rivers from draining. Water that would normally flow downstream encountered a wall of elevated river levels and had nowhere to go. Towns that had never flooded before found water rising in their streets, not from their own rivers, but from the pressure of the system backing up. The confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers became a massive hydraulic jam, each river pushing against the others, seeking any outlet across the landscape. Reservoirs designed to capture excess water were already full from spring rains. Engineers at the core dams on the Missouri River had released water throughout May and June, trying to maintain storage capacity, but the inflow exceeded every calculation. There was no capacity left. The engineers could only watch as the hydrological network exceeded every model and historical record. River forecasts, updated daily, showed crest predictions that kept rising. Communities downstream prepared for levels that never came because the water never crested in the traditional sense. It simply stayed high, week after week, sustained by continuous rainfall upstream. The levees did not fail all at once. They failed from fatigue. Water seeped through earthen embankments, creating soft spots where pressure found weaknesses in compacted clay. Engineers call this process piping, water forcing channels through the levee structure, eroding material from the inside. Pressure built against walls designed for temporary surges, not months of sustained loading. Agricultural levees built by private landowners and farm cooperatives were engineered for routine spring floods, not this. Federal levees, constructed and maintained by the Corps of Engineers, were built to higher standards but still assumed water would rise, peak, and recede within days or weeks. Sandbag reinforcements stacked by exhausted volunteers and National Guard units slowed the process but could not stop it. Thousands of people worked in shifts, filling bags, passing them hand to hand, building temporary barriers on top of permanent structures. The sandbags bought time, sometimes days, sometimes hours. On July 11, a levee protecting Quincy, Illinois gave way. Water poured through a 300-foot gap, inundating the town's industrial district. On July 30, the levee at Kaskaskia Island collapsed, submerging the entire island and its town of 200 residents. The island, surrounded by the Mississippi on 3 sides and a man-made canal on the 4th, had no high ground. When the levee failed, the water came quickly. Residents evacuated by boat. The island would remain underwater for months. Over 1,000 levees failed across 9 states during the summer of 1993. Some breached violently, the earthen wall collapsing in minutes, sending walls of water across farmland and into communities. Others simply disintegrated, clay dissolving into the current, the structure slowly eroding until it could no longer hold. The Corps of Engineers brought in heavy equipment, helicopters, sandbags by the millions. Rock was dumped into breaches. Concrete mats were airlifted to vulnerable sections. It was not enough. The water found every weakness and waited. Time was on its side. Levees that held in July failed in August, not because the water rose higher, but because the structure had been saturated for too long. Highways disappeared under water that did not recede. Interstate 70 closed near St. Charles, Missouri, severing a major east-west corridor. U.S. Route 67 in Illinois was submerged for weeks, cutting off communities that relied on it as their primary connection to the outside world. State highways across Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois were either underwater or so damaged by saturated road beds that they became impassable. Detours stretched for hundreds of miles. Travel times doubled or tripled for routes that had taken an hour. Rail lines buckled under saturated embankments, halting freight across the central corridor. The Burlington Northern and Union Pacific lines, critical for moving grain, coal, and manufactured goods, shut down for weeks. Tracks that remained above water could not be used because bridges on either end had failed or been undermined. Barge traffic on the Mississippi and Missouri rivers stopped entirely. The rivers, normally among the busiest commercial waterways in the world, were too high, too fast, too dangerous for navigation. Locks were inundated. Navigation markers disappeared underwater. The economic arteries of the Midwest were severed. Water treatment plants in Des Moines shut down when the Raccoon and Des Moines rivers overwhelmed intake systems, flooding the treatment facility with contaminated river water. 250,000 people lost access to clean drinking water for 19 days. Temporary wells were drilled in parking lots and parks. Water was trucked in from surrounding states. The National Guard distributed bottled water. Residents boiled what they could. Power lines sagged into floodwaters, creating electrocution hazards. Utility companies shut down substations before the water reached them, cutting power preemptively to prevent equipment damage and public risk. Telecommunications cables failed when underground vaults flooded. Cell towers, less common in 1993, went offline when backup generators ran out of fuel and could not be refilled due to road closures. Entire counties went dark. The infrastructure was not destroyed in moments. It degraded day by day as water-saturated foundations undermined supports, corroded connections. Metal fatigued, concrete spalled, wood swelled and rotted. By August, towns that had been accessible by road were isolated. Supplies came by boat or helicopter. The National Guard operated ferry services across submerged highways. Emergency management coordinators coordinated deliveries of food, medicine, and fuel to communities that could no longer reach stores or hospitals. The 1993 flood occurred during the growing season. 17 million acres of farmland were inundated, an area larger than the entire state of West Virginia. Corn, soybeans, wheat, entire crops drowned in fields that remained underwater for weeks. The plants, submerged for more than a few days, died from lack of oxygen. Farmers could not replant. The growing season is fixed by climate and day length. Once June and July passed, there was no time left for crops to mature before frost. The economic loss extended beyond the immediate harvest. Topsoil, the rich black earth that made the Midwest one of the most productive agricultural regions on the planet, eroded. Currents scoured fields, carrying away inches of soil that had taken centuries to develop. Fields were covered in sand and debris when the water finally receded, rendering land unfarmable without extensive remediation. Some farmers spent years removing sand, re-leveling fields, and rebuilding soil structure. Grain elevators flooded. Stored harvests from previous years held in reserve for market timing or seed were destroyed. Equipment was submerged. Tractors, combines, irrigation systems, machines worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, sat underwater for weeks, their engines and hydraulics ruined. Livestock drowned or starved in isolated pastures. Dairy operations, requiring daily milking and feeding, collapsed when roads became impassable. Cattle and hogs were evacuated where possible, loaded onto trucks and trailers and moved to higher ground, but many were lost. The farming economy of the Midwest, built on predictable cycles of planting and harvest, collapsed. Towns along the rivers evacuated, but there was no clear endpoint. Floods typically rise and fall within days. This one had no end in sight. People left their homes not knowing when, or if, they could return. Temporary shelters filled. Churches, schools, National Guard armories, any building outside the floodplain became housing. Families lived in gymnasiums for weeks, then months. Insurance systems, designed for acute events with clear damage dates, struggled with claims that extended across months. When did the damage occur? When the water first entered a home in June, or when it finally left in September? The disaster was not a single moment of loss. It was a slow unraveling of livelihoods, infrastructure, and certainty. The rivers began to drop in September. Rainfall across the basin decreased. The jet stream pattern finally shifted, allowing dry air to move in. The Mississippi and Missouri rivers fell slowly, receding at the same gradual pace they had risen. The floodwaters withdrew, revealing a landscape transformed. Homes stood coated in dried mud, their interiors destroyed by weeks of saturation. Drywall had dissolved. Insulation hung in wet clumps. Mold covered every surface. Electrical systems were ruined. Furniture was unrecognizable, swollen and warped beyond use. Roads were cratered where currents had scoured pavement and undermined the roadbed. Sections of highway had simply vanished, carried away by the force of moving water. Bridges had collapsed, their supports undermined and swept downstream. Engineers surveyed the wreckage and marked structures for demolition. More than 10,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. 55,000 homes suffered some level of flooding. Entire neighborhoods were condemned. The financial toll exceeded $15 billion, equivalent to roughly $30 billion in current dollars, making it one of the costliest natural disasters in U.S. history at the time. The agriculture losses alone accounted for billions. Some towns, like Valmeyer, Illinois, relocated entirely to higher ground rather than rebuild. The residents voted to move the town 2 miles to a bluff overlooking the floodplain. The old town site was abandoned, its streets and foundations left to slowly disappear under vegetation. Rhineland, Missouri made the same decision. The flood prompted a national reassessment of flood management policy. The federal government, through FEMA and the Corps of Engineers, began buying out properties in floodplains, paying homeowners to leave and demolishing structures. The land was returned to wetlands and agricultural use, removing people from areas that would inevitably flood again. Levees were redesigned. Some were removed entirely, allowing rivers to access their natural floodplains and reducing pressure downstream. Others were reinforced, raised, and rebuilt to higher standards. The Corps shifted its approach from simply containing rivers to managing floods through a combination of structural and non-structural measures. But the lesson of 1993 was not about infrastructure alone. It was about duration, about systems that assume water will rise and fall, not rise and stay. The flood ended quietly, the water draining away as slowly as it had arrived. What remained was mud, ruin, and the knowledge that the rain someday would return.